This is really about being free to create what you want your life to look like. We each are our own hero. And how do we take the challenges that come our way and see those as the birth process of us becoming heroic? Can you meet that judgment that ultimately will surface with neutrality?
This is the Wall Street Coach Podcast with Ann Curtin.
Welcome back, everybody, to the Wall Street Coach Podcast. I am very excited today to have an author who I am meeting for the first time. She's like my new favorite author and a former sister from New York City, Michele Wucker. She coined the famous term, which you have probably heard, the Gray Rhino. And that is in reference to obvious, probable, and impactful risks. Michele is first of all, her writing is amazing. I read all the time, and her book is without any jargon, but incredibly deep and incredibly eye-opening. Her newest book is actually called You Are What You Risk. And I can't say enough about how important this book is for every trader to read, but honestly, I think for every person, because this is going to show up in your personal life, whether it's your health or in your business, and or around choices by way of real estate decisions, by way of family decisions, by way of every interaction. The knowing and understanding your own risk profile is going to make a big difference in all the relationships you have. So I'm going to finish reading her formal bio, but I'm very excited to have you here today, Michele. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Now I don't know how I'm going to live up to that amazing introduction, but I'm looking forward to it.
You will undoubtedly live up to it. So I just want to speak a little bit about your other books, because You Are What You Risk actually came really out of her first book, The Great Rhino. Is a bestseller, How to Recognize and Act on the Obvious Dangers We Ignore. And if you have the time, I can't recommend enough, viewers and listeners, please watch her 9-minute TED Talk on the Great Rhino, because in it, she really articulates how the concept of a black swan, which, we all heard about when that book came out, is actually sort of, in my opinion, kind of gets all the attention when really it's the great rhinos that are the ones that we should probably be much more familiar with. So bottom line is China's leadership actually has used to frame and communicate its entire crackdown on financial risk thanks to her book. Her book is actually sitting, how do you say his name, the leader of China's name again? Yes, her book sits on his desk, for crying out loud. And this metaphor has actually moved markets, shaped financial policies, and it's made headlines around the world. It also helped frame the warnings way ahead of the global pandemic with COVID-19. And this is a very sexy piece of news. It inspired the lyrics of the hit pandemic pop single Blue and Gray by the mega band BTS about depression as a gray rhino. 2 million views for Michele's TED Talk. That was done in 2019 about the Great Rhino. And also Michele is the founder of Chicago-based strategy firm Gray Rhino and Company. She draws on 3 decades of experience, first as a financial journalist and then as a media and think tank executive. She's been honored as a young global leader of the World Economic Forum, and she's also Guggenheim Fellow. She's held leadership positions at the Chicago Council of Global Affairs, World Policy Institute, and International Finance Review. She's a sought-after media commentator on the COVID-19 pandemic now, so we're very lucky to even get to have her here. Michele, tell me, what did I not include in your amazing bio?
Thank you so much. It's, it's funny to see how my life has actually come full circle. And when I was in high school, I actually wanted to be a psychiatrist. I'm very interested in psychology.
Wow.
And ended up going into finance and all sorts of other things, but have sort of come full circle. As you know, there's a lot of psychology and social psychology in You Are What You Risk. So
yes.
So there's a little bit of everything.
So you came home again. You're coming home to where you wanted to be in the beginning. That's really kind of cool. That's probably why I think it reads so, it reads so smoothly, because it feels a little bit to me like not in self-help, like in the sense of like, I was able to self-help myself by looking at the way you describe things. And I was like, oh, do I do that? How am I experiencing this? I'm learning how to become a day trader. And because a lot of the clients I work with now are day traders, I'm looking through the lens of how is this going to benefit them? Never mind how is it going to benefit me personally. So it really reads so smoothly, even though you're talking about some big concepts. So tell us how it came about, where it came from with your focus on this.
Well, as you know, the Gray Rhino came out of the difference between the Argentinian and the Greek debt crises, where Argentina had a chance to do it in a little more orderly way, and they didn't take it. And Greece, it was still messy, but they actually sat down, Greece and its creditors, and they avoided a much bigger chaos. And I was one of the early voices on the Greek debt restructuring, coming out and saying, you've got to take a haircut, you've got to do preemptive restructuring, or the euro and everything else is going to come down. And right around the time that Greece and its creditors found an agreement in 2012, I was sort of wrestling with some personal things. I'd been running an organization for about 5 years, and was thinking about what I want to do next, where I wanted to go, and hadn't been writing for a while, and realized I needed to do that. And so the question in my mind was really, what makes the difference between a Greece and an Argentina? A company that sees the big scary thing coming at them and does something, and a company or country that doesn't, and they just let themselves get flattened. So that was the real origin for the Gray Rhino concept. The gray part came out a little bit of a joke about the black swan, but it's actually very, very different. It's not a derivative metaphor. When this rhino, big scary thing with a horn coming at you, 2 tons, when that came into my head, I was in my office with a friend who was a corporate M&A lawyer. So he made kind of a black swan joke. He's like, oh, you could call it a black rhino. And I had been to the zoo when I was in grade school, and I had this faint idea that there was such a thing as the black rhino, and that there is a particular formal name of a species, but there's also a white rhino species. Neither one of them is the color that they're called. They're both gray. They're not black. They're not white.
Wow.
And so that, to me, seemed to be a great metaphor for how much more likely than we want to admit we are to ignore the big thing coming at us. And so it's, the opposite of the black swan, which is so improbable you can't even picture it. But it's also different from the elephant in the room, which just stands there. And by definition, nobody says or does anything about it, which is not okay. Like the Gray Rhino is a thing that people are talking about, that everybody knows you need to do something about, and they're talking about it, and only some people seize the moment, and they get out of the way, or they actually harness the power of this crisis to do something better. And the unlucky few get trampled. So that book came out in 2016, and I was doing book tour all around the world. It came out in China in 2017 and was an immediate bestseller. I've made 6 or 7 trips to China since then, until none of us could, until we had to stop traveling. And in China, this 20-something young man came up to me. I was giving a book talk in Shanghai, and he wanted an autograph and a selfie. And he says, "Oh, you've helped me so much with my life." And I had to say, "Are you talking to someone behind me?" I do policy and finance. I don't really do self-help, although it's interesting that the new book has self-help applications. And also on so many of my other talks, people would always ask, "How do I apply this to my personal life?" Yeah. And then a couple of bloggers just went out and did it. A guy in Indiana did this wonderful blog post about breast cancer, and other people applied it to, career changes and relationships and personal finance and all of these things. And I was really wrestling with what do I do with this? Because I'm a policy and finance person. It's, it's not my experience, it's not my brand, but people seem to really organically want this, this explanation of why people personally deal with a Gray Rhino or not. And so I was talking to my friends about it. I'm really torn. I'm struggling. Yeah. And a very dear friend of mine, CEO of a private equity firm, said, "There's more of a connection than you think." He said, "Last week our investment committee met, and we talked about the investments that disappointed." I think he probably used some stronger words than that.
Yeah, possibly.
But he said in every case, all of the warning signs were there. He says, but it's not what you would think. He's like, it wasn't the finances, it wasn't the technology, it wasn't the product, it wasn't the macroeconomic environment. It was bad personal risk decisions by the CEO. It was the speeding. It was the drunk driving. It was the cheating. It was the domestic violence. And they didn't pay attention to those personal signs.
Yeah.
And so I realized, wait a minute, there actually is this connection between personal and business. And then at the same time, I was getting a lot of questions from people about why is this so huge in Asia? But at the same time, I was getting all this pushback in the States going, black swan, black swan. When they were really misusing the term, either using it in hindsight as a cop-out or like spotting ahead, this armchair black swan spotting, when by definition, you can't see ahead of time. So it didn't make any sense. And what people were really looking for was a gray rhino. And so people said, why is there such a big difference between China and the West? And I would go to China and everybody was talking about financial risk. And in the States, people were like, let's pump more air into the market. And, of course, day traders benefit from that right now and are continuing to benefit from it. But I'm kind of looking ahead at the rhino that is creating for the real economy. And like people wouldn't talk about it in the States. And so I was like, what's up with that? And so that became this sort of cultural, personal question. What does your culture and your country mean for whether you deal with a gray rhino or not? And what does your personal attitude mean for dealing with the gray rhino? And so the book actually looks at this feedback loop among the three, which is a very risky thing to do because publishers like, the self-help shelf or the current affairs shelf or the business books shelf. And I just didn't feel I could address it adequately by not addressing all three. And so I guess, if you think about it, the thrust of the book really is a business book, but, as you said, there's a sort of a self-help aspect. There are certainly some policy and global relevant things, and it all works together.
Yeah, I'm so happy that you were true to that, working them all together, because I feel that sometimes publishers are limited in their perspective. And I see who we are as people as a cobweb as how we show up in business. They can't be separated. And that, evidence of that colleague of yours who saw that these companies that blew up, that there were these signs. And, that's why maybe we're going to create the new topic, Michele. We'll tell publishers that we have something here, that the personal is what shows up in business, and they just got to get, kind of up with the program. Because I think we are seeing something that needs to be looked at that isn't paid attention to enough.
Absolutely. And, doing the reporting for the book, I had an experience that I've never had before. Before A Gray Rhino, there were actually two other books, much more policy focused. And with this book, people I was asking questions about were saying, I've never heard these questions before. And I'm learning so much from the questions you're asking me. Like the interviewees were learning from the question as much as I was learning from them, and readers will learn from them. And, some of them saying to me, this is just really, really important stuff. Yes. And so it is opening a brand new conversation, it's exciting. I mean, it's risky, definitely, but it's very exciting to me. And as I talk about in the book, if you have a really strong sense of purpose and why something is important, it doesn't become so quote unquote risky. It becomes the path that you have to take, and there's much less choice involved. And for me, risk is all about making choices. And when you have a very clear sense of what you really need to do, then making any choice other than that one just doesn't work for you.
Yes, you spoke a lot in the book about the concept of agency, and that's what it sounds like you're talking about now. So just speak a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I'm so glad you picked up on that, because in 2016, you started seeing in the popular mainstream media all over the place this word agency, human agency, sense of human agency, this belief in your power to affect things, and talk about a lack of agency, which often was used as a way to describe the sort of, new, Trump movement and all of these people who felt like they didn't have any power over things. And they also felt like, the government didn't have any power. It wasn't able to do things, partly because of all the gridlock and polarization that we have. And once I started realizing that, it was just like everywhere. Like, it's like, what is the bug? The Volkswagen bug game you play in the car.
Yeah, where you find the red Volkswagen, then you see it everywhere. Yes.
Yeah, and you start seeing, so exactly. Or, you buy a kind of car and then you see the same car everywhere. Right. It was kind of like that. And, the thing that really clinched it was when Gwyneth Paltrow was interviewed in the New York Times Magazine, and she used the word, sense of human agency. And I just went, whoa. And, looked at the Google searches for it, and it just went way up. So clearly it's something that's on people's mind, this sense of, do we have power to change things or not? And that sense of agency is so closely tied to the risks that you take. When you look at risk perception, so there's two things. There's the risk perception, there's the how risky you think something is, whether you're paying attention to it at all, how worried you are about it, whether you even see something as a risk or not. And then on the other hand, there's sort of your appetite or your tolerance, like how much are you willing to take on? And both our perceptions and our tolerance are affected by how much control we feel we have over something and how voluntarily we are taking something on. And you could see this in the aftermath of the 737 MAX tragedy, in that there was a week or so, after the Ethiopian Airlines crash and before the planes were pulled. Then you see the competing statements coming out from the pilots and the flight attendants. And of course, the pilots have tons of knowledge about how the system works, and they feel a lot of control because they're the ones driving. And they came out with a statement going, "Oh yeah, I can stay in the air, it's fine." And the flight attendants were like, "No, I do not want to fly on that." And it's a great example. So when you're looking at your own attitude about certain kinds of risk, and this goes for everything from health to finance to career to relationships, the more knowledge you have about something, the more confident you are taking the risk. Yeah. And similarly, this sort of amount of knowledge helps you feel more control over things. There's really this feedback loop, and also there's a feedback loop with the risk itself. I talk about it often as being kind of like Schrodinger's cat, where you don't really know the state, but the act of observing actually changes the state of things.
Yes.
And risk is like that. The act of acknowledging and observing it, if you're smart, leads you to do more to try to prepare for it and learn about it, which actually reduces the risk that whatever it is going to go out of hand, because you're going to have more tools to deal with it.
Yeah. It's funny. As a coach, one of the things that I am a huge advocate of people developing within themselves is a comfort with discomfort. Because if you can learn how to not be so triggered with discomfort, you ultimately have short-term discomfort, but long-term it dissipates because you've been able to sit with it. It's in Hawaii they say same is what I want to say to what you just said.
It's true. And that goes into this relationship between risk and uncertainty. There was a while about a year ago when it seemed like every single Bacon email list that I was on had uncertainty in the headlines of the emails that were showing up in my inbox. It was like the it word last year, right? Wow. And I actually wrote for my column in Strategy and Business about how uncertainty, the ability to deal with uncertainty, had actually been identified as one of the top leadership skills for the 21st century. And I talk about that a little bit in You Are What You Risk. And, dealing with uncertainty is not easy, but actually the better you are at dealing with risks, which actually means the better you are at making choices, even when they're hard choices, the more comfortable you are at dealing with uncertainty. Yeah. And another really interesting point about risk and uncertainty is that, the classical economic definition of risk versus uncertainty is that risk is something that you can quantify. It's a sort of an uncertainty that you can quantify. You can estimate the probability of. And uncertainty is something you can't really easily assign a number to it. So, Frank Knight and John Maynard Keynes wrote about this. And so in the sort of professional quant finance world, you get these actuarial tables, you get all these calculations, and people are trading based on the pricing of risk. But when you get down to it, some of this pricing of, these quantifiable risks is pulled straight out of the air, or, another 3-letter word that starts with A. And it's, like the subprime mortgage packages.
Yep.
Those MBSs where, oh, sure, yeah, investment grade. And so I think it's important to tell ourselves sometimes that the risk that we calculate is often an illusion. It's a way to feel more control. Ironically,
Yes.
you were just talking about control. It's a way to feel control over something. And so if you see that somebody else has assigned a risk number to something, you want to ask, where are they coming from? Are they trying to sell something? Or, and sometimes they're trying to sell the rating. And so it looks less risky than it really is. And so this perception of risk aspect is so important. And that's why we need to understand the biases that we often bring to our risk judgments.
Yeah, I've heard that often about the quants, that, everybody thinks, oh, it's so impersonal, but that those numbers are still being fed into those algorithms by human beings. And human beings are not going to be robotic, no matter how much we may be a left brainer or a type A, we're still human, and we're going to have a perspective. And that's where those numbers clearly came from when we were talking about the mortgage crisis. Like, oh, well, these are, that was the way it had always been. So they presumed they were correct.
It's true. And with algorithms, you hear about this with the controversies about, algorithms and facial identification and things. Well, those algorithms are fed underlying information, which is based on human biases. And so the algorithms often amplify these human biases. And so that's, it's actually quite concerning when you look at rating. And, I forget the latest numbers, but, the percentage of trades that are done algorithmically, this high-speed trading is quite astonishing. And it seems like it's getting bigger and bigger all the time, which means that there are all these trades, these market movements out there that are affected by human biases that are like so far deep into this algorithm that sometimes we don't even know what they are.
Yeah. For sure. Because our audience primarily are day traders, what do you feel would be the most shocking thing that your book would have to teach them?
The most shocking. There were so many things that were shocking to me. And I guess there's like the most shocking and maybe the most important message. But the thing that was most shocking to me was the physiological side of things. That if you eat spicy food, there's research that shows that you're going to be more risk-seeking a few hours afterwards. Yeah. There's other research shows, the fragrances that you're smelling. There's, different kinds of smells will produce, different heart rate reactions and different stress reactions, and in turn different risk decisions. And there's even some of it showing that flowery smelling lotion, which is often perceived as more quote unquote feminine, which is a whole other story that you get into in the book. But but sometimes there's some men who, if it's suggested that they're like less masculine, they actually try to appear more masculine by taking riskier and riskier trades. So I think if you put all that together, it's really that a lot of the risk decisions that you make are based on things that you haven't even thought about at all. You think you're actively making a decision, but it's the temperature in the room. It's what you had for lunch. It's like whether you're a smoker or not. It's the people around you. It's your culture. It's all of these things you haven't even thought about. And you think you're making a risk decision for yourself, but without understanding all of those other influences on why you're taking the risks that you are not making those decisions independently. But once you do understand them, you can actually optimize your habits to make much better risk decisions.
I'm trying to remember in the book when you talk about temperature, because, the hedge fund, I remember working out, they all had those fleece vests on because the offices were kept at like 65 degrees, if not cooler. So remind me, what did it say again about the temperature?
Well, there was a study of birds, I think, and like the colder it got, I forget how they measured the riskiness of the birds, but or maybe it's the farther they would fly or whatever. But the more risk they would take to get food, and I think that there is a something under your thinking process is like we got to survive. Yeah. But also people, there was somebody who I think was immersed in ice in very, very cold temperatures. It actually slows down a lot of responses, including your risk response. And I've also heard that they keep offices cold when there are a lot of men, because men are expected, well, not so much as they used to be, but they were always expected to wear suits to work and had like several layers more clothing on than women. And so there's two things. There's one that sort of physiological response to cold, but there's also, it depends on whether you like cold or not, because your comfort level also is important. And you want to be comfortable enough that you're not stressed and making bad decisions, but you don't want to be so comfortable that you're not reaching and making that stretch goal and making decisions that are out of your comfort zone.
Yeah. And so you started to say surprising when I asked you about the most shocking. What was there another piece to that you were going to speak to? Surprising and or important, I think was the word you used.
Just supposed to be important that the thing that I think day traders should take away is that you want to do a deep dive into why you're making the risk decisions that you are, so that you're not led astray. There's a lot of research showing that at the top of markets, that's when you see a lot of retail investors participating. And we certainly saw that with the mortgage-backed securities and things. And the bankers are talking about, we're spreading risk, as far as we can, and we're democratizing the markets. In fact, I remember it must have been like 1999, 2000. It was the height of the dot-com bubble. And that was the last time I heard so much talk about democratizing markets. And, I was a financial journalist by then, and a lot of my friends were getting poached from one financial site to another. And, at, wages that we just couldn't even imagine as journalists. And one friend got one of those jobs, and the mission of the site was to democratize finance. And I worry a little bit about, democratize finance means push the risk off on the little guys.
Yeah.
But we have this very, very interesting dynamic right now, this sort of, David versus Goliath, now that we've got social media and all of these new influences on mood. And those are changing the trading dynamics in ways that, a lot of my professional finance friends don't understand. And I don't pretend to understand. I mean, I don't think anybody should claim to pretend to understand it, because it's so new. But you're seeing different influences on which directions stocks are going.
Gosh, if I think about what you just said, Michele, in your book, you talked about the people that you spend your time with, right? So if I think now, your book, I'm starting to look through your book as a new lens on the world. And what I'm seeing right now is GameStop. Part of that momentum is because of that cultural aspect of, we're going to show the man, right? Whether they were right or wrong, but that cultural, everybody's in it with me, right? That probably was a big part of what your book speaks to around the people you're spending your time with.
Absolutely. And also a phenomenon in the book that social scientists call risky shift.
Risky shift, right.
Exactly. When you're in a group of people, you're likely to be either way too conservative, which is risky in and of itself, or take way bigger risks. Yes. And it depends on your culture, it depends on other things, it depends on the composition of the group. But the group dynamics tend to magnify the mistakes that individual humans make. And being in a group also makes it harder to flag potential alarm signals. This is something I talk about a lot in the Gray Rhino, and somewhat less in You Are What You Risk. So that, who are your peers? And if you don't have that chatty best friend in there, the Aquafina character in Crazy Rich Asians who's saying, don't wear that red dress.
Right.
If you don't have that person who's going to tell you the things that you don't want to hear, well, do your damnedest to go out and find one of those, and make sure that the sources that you're looking at come from a variety of places, and a variety of perspectives, really open up your perspective on the world so that you can see different possibilities, so that you're open to and aware of risk factors that you might not have been aware of. But that also means that you'll be open to opportunities you might not have been aware of.
Yes, for sure. God, Aquavina's character in that movie was the best. I mean, that was it. I just thought everybody needs to have that kind of a person in their lives, because she just was a truth teller repeatedly. The other thing I'm thinking too right now is that what your book is actually an incredibly self-serving argument for why it's so important to be a participant in diversity.
Absolutely. And this goes into, it is something I went into in the Gray Rhino as well, that, if everybody around the table comes from, the same boarding school and the same age and the same background and the same perspective, this groupthink phenomenon, this inability to see alternative perspectives gets that much stronger. And it's particularly a problem if a company doesn't have people who can relate to their customers or their investors. And another interesting thing, I go into this in the gender chapter, is that when you have a mixed gender or other mixed demographic group, people actually do think a little bit more about the kind of risks that they're going to take, and you come up with smarter decisions. I challenge in the book this idea of risk averse versus risk seeking, because this idea of risk averse is all things being equal, and all things are rarely equal. There's some research that actually shows that women are more willing than men to take social risks, like speaking up, and I think it's partly because we've had more experience speaking up in situations where it's really hard to speak up, where you're the only woman in the room. You hear about this heap heating phenomenon, where a woman has a brilliant idea and everybody ignores her. And then 5 minutes later, a guy says the same thing and everyone says,
exactly.
Women are a lot more experienced dealing with rejection, with not being rewarded for doing the difficult thing, which means they've got actually a much more developed risk muscle. Or talking about millennials in the market, I talked to this really wonderful financial advisor, Dennis Nolte, who works with a lot of millennials and has a background actually in psychology, which I think is why he's so insightful. But he says, well, if you've got a student loan that you're paying close to 10% on, and the stock market is looking really toppy, and everyone's worried about inflation and the Fed increasing rates, and the possibility of things falling and volatility much higher, and all the predictions saying it's not going to rise as much as it's going to, and you've got a clear 10% implied return by paying down your student loan, well, doesn't that kind of make sense? And if you don't have a rainy day fund, does it really make sense to put half of your savings into GameStop or whatever? And I hear stories like that of millennials having, $50,000 in savings and putting half of it into something very, very risky, very, very volatile, not a diversified portfolio. And it scares me. It really does.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. And what would you say informs that comfort, or, perhaps inappropriate discomfort with taking those kind of risks? In addition to just the people around them, there's other factors, and just get into some of them a little bit for people, for those who haven't read the book yet.
Well, I think part of it is your underlying personality. And I met this really amazing psychologist, Jeff Trickey, in the UK, with his company is called Psychological Consultancy, in this cute little town, Tunbridge Wells, an hour's train ride south of London, that I was lucky enough to go and visit. And they developed something called the Risk Type Compass, which is based on a lot, years and years of social psychology research and psychometric tests, which are a whole other controversy I'm not going to go into. You got to use them right. They're useful up to a point, but if you abuse them, they can be used wrong. But I think there's a lot of use for this Risk Type Compass that looks at how impulsive or methodical you are in dealing with risk. And then on the other pole, how anxious or calm you tend to be in face of risk. and then there's some, some points in between. And those personality traits, a lot of them are innate, and they'll actually shape how you respond to certain experiences, like a shock. And those are really important. And knowing yourself is hugely important. And, you need some good introspection and reflection here. There was one woman he talked to who was very disappointed with the results of her test because she wanted to see herself as more adventurous and carefree and risk taking. But she actually was able to put that insight to use in helping with the company's GDPR strategy, the sort of data privacy regulations that came out a couple of years ago. They're the reason that you're getting carpal tunnel syndrome from clicking on every website saying you accept stupid cookies. So they need like a pass going, yes, I accept the stupid cookies. And
exactly.
But if you don't follow those, you get all sorts of fines and things. And so she took it upon herself, and she was a very methodical kind of person and very attentive to risk, and she actually made sure that the company was prepared. This was a company in Europe, and so when you understand your strengths, actually that'll help you decide where you're more comfortable investing or what kind of job you're going to take. It's very interesting that certain professions have a concentration of certain risk types, but it also tells you, hey, I'm likely to go jump off the cliff. I'm gonna leap without looking. Maybe I need someone in my life who's a little more methodical and a little more anxious than I am. Someone who complements my weaknesses. And I think we could all use that. And when you're looking at a team, look at that composition among the team. You go to, say, a law firm, and the partners are often likely to have very similar risk patterns, although it depends on the kind of lawyer. I mean, a litigator and contracts lawyer are going to have very, very different profiles. Yeah, but have a different professions, different demographics, and demographics aren't an exact proxy for risk takings. We've got a lot of stereotypes about different ethnic groups and genders and all of that. But that break some ideas. So
breaks them down. Some of those, perspectives that we all think the gender. Name a couple of stereotypes that are not the way we think we've always believed them to be.
Well, I just mentioned the millennials. So, you see all these headlines. Millennials are so risk averse. And it's like, they're actually kind of smart. A lot of them are. and millennials, having grown up with some of the financial turbulence of the last decade or so, they've actually got more experience with uncertainty than my generation did at our age. Women, again, you see all of these headlines and academic studies. Oh, women are risk averse. Well, this wonderful, wonderful scholar, Julie Nelson at University of Boston, did a study where she looked at all of these other studies, sort of like a meta study, and she applied new statistical techniques. And she looked at how these studies were done and the degrees of statistical significance, which often were this small or, sometimes even smaller than that, actually not quite as significant as anyone would count. And she said a lot of them look at averages. But when you look at the range of risk views across men and women, she said there's a 95% overlap. Wow. So this whole women are risk averse, it's just like, makes my head want to explode. There are differences, as I mentioned before, social settings, men are more likely to risky sex, risky driving. There are some situation specific differences. And what's interesting too is that with similar amounts of knowledge and experience, a lot of the differences converge. Wow. So you have an inexperienced man and an inexperienced woman. The inexperienced man is much more likely to do the leaping before looking. And, the woman's going to be a little bit more, measured and thoughtful and make a better risk decision. And there's something called stereotype threat, which is that in many situations, we'll take the kind of risk decisions that we think we're supposed to take, as opposed to what we're comfortable taking. So there's a sort of risk dysphoria, you might call it.
Yes.
And, it was very interesting. I had some friends who were beta reading a draft of the book. And I had sent this chapter on gender to a friend who actually ended up being quoted in the book. A man, really, really smart, risk and data science consultant very thoughtful. And anyway, he wrote me back with some of his experiences being, the man who kind of raises his hand and said, well, have we considered this? Have we considered that? And he said, it's not a typical male response. And that he'll sometimes get these, alpha male yellings, what do you mean? What are you talking about? And that, that women are more likely to bring in experts, to seek that kind of knowledge, to make themselves more comfortable and to make better decisions. And so just as some women, I think particularly, younger, not as confident, might be taking less risk than they personally would be comfortable with because they think they, should be a certain way. Yeah. I think the same thing is true for men. Now, there's probably some men who are showing a certain amount of bravado when it's not really what they're comfortable with. And that's actually, it's not good for anyone.
No, that it almost sounds like I'm a huge fan of the documentary called The Mask You Live In, which speaks about the cultural indoctrination of men to be these manly men and how they are, I think, like you spoke to before, this that sense of I have to show up this way because I won't be considered a real man if I don't.
Yeah, and it's I'm gonna check that out. It sounds fantastic. But the scholar Michael Kimmel has done some really good stuff on this, or Jessica Klein writing about bullying and these sort of how these gender stereotypes play into all of these factors in our society, and they're actually quite dangerous.
Yeah. Wow. Did you go to say something, Lucas? I
was just thinking about how it seems like so many things are part of our culture, and that we discount it. We're like, we're this individual and we make all of our decisions. And then you look at, when you look at the broad data, it's like, oh, maybe I'm just part of this culture and everything is just, I will kind of act like the people around me.
Yeah. So. Yes. And that's exactly why I ended up taking this, this broader approach to the book, to the business, the individual, the organization, and the broader society. There's a chapter in the book about risk differences by country. Mm-hmm. And I was just fascinated by a lot of stereotypes that Asians and Westerners have about each other are completely out of whack. And, there was an experiment it was like a financial risk experiment where both the Americans and the Chinese students thought that the Americans would be much bigger risk takers. And what ended up happening was that they both chose about the same level of riskiness, which surprised everybody. But when they looked at the perceptions part of it, the Chinese actually didn't think it was quite as risky as the Americans did. So they perceived the risk as being less. And so actually, their risk tolerance was lower. Like the amount of risk they were willing to take was lower because they just didn't think it was as risky in the first place. And, the Americans, yes, they were riskier, but it ended up at the same point. And it shows how risk tends to be it's almost like a room full of funhouse mirrors. And when you start looking at it and, the more aware you are of a risk, the more likely you are to do things to deal with it. And the researchers looked at their theory about the difference for this was something called the cushion effect, which is that in a collectivist society where you feel that there's a social network or that the government will step in and solve a problem, you're more likely to take certain risks. It's why, when I go to China, people will, people just despairing. They say, my parents want to buy this overpriced apartment in Beijing and I'm worried about it. But they think, the government's not going to let the market crash. When, in fact, the government has been trying very hard to kind of slowly rein in the property market. And, it's not always true. You go to China and there's, they don't have as big of a social safety net actually as we do, which is also a paradox because, that's not what Americans would, associate with the structure of the Chinese economy. And so, whether you feel like you have a fallback or not is hugely important. There was an article I saw a couple of years ago about social entrepreneurs being mostly rich white kids because they've got friends and family money and they've got this network to fall back on. And there's tons of people who are not, upper middle class and wealthy white kids who've got really great ideas for saving the world. What if we could channel the capital to them to be able to take those sort of risks? Or you look at education. It's the the biggest financial risk that most people take, and you take it really early before your risk brain is completely formed.
Yes.
And so that, I think that goes into a lot of the debates we're having right now about student loans and things like that.
Yeah, you talked about that in chapter 6, gender risk and stereotype threat, where you spoke specifically to this group of women founders who had to have a man in the room to raise VC money. Talk a little bit about that. That was very amazing.
It was really powerful. Well, I sat down with Genevieve Tiers, who's the co-founder of SitterCity.com, which she recently actually sold. And she's a couple years ago, Entrepreneur Magazine named her the woman who raised the most amount of money in Illinois. And she's an amazing, dynamic person, very supportive of women entrepreneurs. And we talked for quite a while. And she told me that story. She was in a room with about a dozen top CEOs and founders in Chicago, and they were sharing among themselves as it was crazy that they had to have a man in the room in order for VCs to think that they quote unquote took enough risks. And I mean, her chief technology officer was the man who later became her husband. And, so she had someone, who was there and who of course said, she's the one who's really driving this. But there are lots of those stereotypes across the VC industry. And there's a study that I cite of people who looked at researchers who looked at measures like, how many loans people took and how much investment they did and all these, risk measures. And they said, actually, women are not more risk averse, that word that I hate, than men. And they actually said that in many cases, women founded startups are more likely to succeed. So it's a matter of risk savvy, risk wisdom, and not risk aversion. And you think about like all the money that's being just left on the table because VCs are not making these better business bets.
Yes, I hope you're listening, you VCs out there, because you need to hear this for all women's sake, because they are the ones who I do feel want to change the world, and they're not going to be able to do so if they don't have the ability to raise the funds. Absolutely.
And this judgment about who's a good credit risk is very, very complicated. And people don't often enough ask the question, what's the risk of not doing this?
Yeah.
That's a great point. There is that risk.
That's what I often think about is the risk that we innately take when we don't make a decision or we choose not to do something. There's inherent risk in that. Could you expand on that?
If I could quote my favorite band when I was in high school, Rush.
Sure.
Choose not to decide. You still have made a choice.
Love it. We're going to the rock band today, no matter what. All right. My favorite quote, that I say this already, is time management is risk management. Talk a little bit more about that.
Absolutely. The choices about what you're going to do with your time, with your life, are so important. I think over the last year, a lot of us have had this moment like, what if I don't make it through the pandemic? What am I doing with my time? Of course, the options of what you can do with your time the last year have been a lot more limited, but it's led a lot of people to rethink what they're doing with their life. So it's time management, on a big scale life choices level, but it's also on the micro level. This young guy came to a workshop that I did on the Gray Rhino method, how to use this 5-stage method to make better decisions and to do a better job of dealing with the obvious things that you need to deal with, but aren't getting solved. And he said, I have such a big problem with time management. He said, I'm just not good at it. And that's my Gray Rhino. And he started talking about it. And I said, well, what have you been trying to do to deal with it? And he said, well, I made an app. And he said, because none of the apps out there were really doing what I wanted. And he said, but it's funny when I'm working on this app, I'm just really focused and we can move forward with it. And that occurred to me. I was like, time management is not actually your problem. It's it's actually what you're doing with your time on a much bigger scale. It's like, if you're doing something that you love and that you're good at and that people want, then you're much more likely to be using that time wisely. And that just really struck me. And, you know, I think it was Genevieve Pierce again who talked about mothers becoming really good risk takers because they had to make those choices with their time, with the, you know, juggling childcare and all these other things, which, you know, we've seen all the stories about, you know, women dropping out of the economy because of the pandemic. So that's a whole other ball of wax to talk about. But it's true that every single choice you make during the day, whether it's how to use your time or anything else, really is a risk. Are you wasting that time? And when you start thinking about your mortality, that question becomes even more important.
Yeah, absolutely. There's another part in your book that I just wanted to speak to. I'm just looking through my notes here to just get it up here, where you talked about these 5 categories: inherent and enduring traits, transitory internal states of mind, physical states, activities, effects, roles, and evaluations of these traits.
Yeah, well, I think it's a chance to talk about the risk fingerprint, which I actually can't believe I haven't brought up yet.
Please do it.
And, you know, it's actually this, you know, this concept that, and it's why it's on the cover of the book, which is that all the choices that you make about risk identify you to the world just as distinctively as a fingerprint left on a glass in one of those crime movies that they you know, duck the black powder on. And they also define you. And yeah, there is actually a bit of a feedback loop between them. But just like a real fingerprint, there is this sort of innate part, the personality types that we talked about before. And then, and those are, you know, genetically fixed. They're very, you know, they're hard to change, you know, which is why detectives use them. But then there are the experience you've had. You know, you cut your finger and that's going to indelibly change your fingerprint because there's a scar. And the experiences that we go through shape our risk relationships. And what's interesting about that is that they don't affect everybody in the same way. You know, some people will go through a jarring, harrowing experience, which also is, it's often something that's unexpected. It's not a matter of risk taking or, you know, it might be the result of a bad risk choice, but often it's just something that comes out of the blue, you know, a civil war or whatever. And some people go through that and they realize, if I got through that, I can get through anything. And they become much more comfortable with risk. And there are other people who shy way back from it. There's a company in Central America. I talked to the CEO, who's a 40-something, recently named fourth generation, I think, CEO. Wow. And the older generations were very concerned with preservation of capital. Why? Because during civil wars, they lost 75% of what they had because the government seized it. And the younger generation was much more concerned with things becoming obsolete and the company losing the value that way. And I actually, you know, helped him to see that having an open discussion about risks and why people felt the way they did about risk helped kind of, you know, break open that logjam of the different generations wanting different things. So there's that experience that affects your risk fingerprint differently depending on you know, who you are, and also, you know, your generation, where you are in life. You know, even, you know, in investment advisors say, okay, well, when you're young, you can afford to be much more aggressive. And when you're older, then, you know, you may actually have a bigger cushion and, you know, you've got room for more aggressive investments, but you also want to preserve a certain amount of income. I mean, right now it's hard with income investments because bonds aren't hardly paying anything at all. But that, you know, that where you are in life, your experience, your peer group, you know, somebody who's, you know, like the millennials I was talking about before, who've gone through a lot of uncertainty in the world around them, are going to have a very, very different point of view from people who didn't go through this. But there are also like habits and the things that you do. Going back to the fingerprint, you know, if you're doing manual labor, you've got calluses on your hands. You know, it's going to look different from if you use that soft, feminine smelling lotion and keep your hands soft. And actually that sort of ongoing habit of looking at your risk fingerprint and what you can do to change the circumstances is so powerful. And that involves surrounding yourselves with the right people, as I talked about before.
Yeah.
It also involves, what does it take to make you feel more comfortable in a certain situation?
Yeah.
And for some people, tons more information really helps.
Yeah.
And for some people, they just get overwhelmed and freak out.
Yeah.
So understand what makes you comfortable with it. And then, look at your circumstances and look at this portfolio of risks across your life, your career, your relationship, your health, your finances, your, sort of ethical stance. You probably have very different attitudes in each of these buckets. And if you're looking at all of them and you want to do something really risky in one bucket, it probably makes sense to find ways to create a sense of security in one of the other ones. And if you're at, 5 on a scale of 1 to 5 in all of your buckets, you might be on the risk burnout scale. So, but this mindfulness is such a huge and powerful tool, being aware of your risk fingerprint, and then exercising risk empathy, understanding the risk fingerprints of the people around you, whether it's your team or your employees or your investors or your family. Yeah. That also, because the people around you affect your ability to take risk, that also affects you. If you if you understand what makes them more comfortable, they can be there for you as well.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. How would you recommend somebody does identify their risk fingerprint? Is there particular steps you recommend they take to begin with if this is the first time they're even hearing this concept?
Sure. Well, there's of course a lot more about it in the book.
Yep.
But one of the first questions you ask yourself, okay, what's the biggest risk that you ever took? People love that one, and it usually kind of really gets people thinking for a while, and it really surprises people.
How about you, Lucas? Can you think of it off the top of your head?
No, I'm not sure. Probably moving away from home, like to, Los Angeles. That was a pretty big risk. Not having a job. That was fun.
Because the moving and the not having a job on top of each other.
Yeah. That's amazing. What was your answer, Michele, to that question when you posed it?
Oh goodness. It's, I look back at life and there are so many things. I think it was really committing to writing, and I've sort of retaken that risk in different ways throughout my life. But when I finished graduate school, I was a reporter first for Dow Jones and then an analyst for International Financing Review. And, I was paying back my student loans, and it was a very good job for just out of school at the time. And the risk I took was actually neglecting to look at this risk across these buckets. So I was commuting from Manhattan to Jersey City, and a super high stress job. I mean, writing about these, trading markets all day long, trading Brady bonds, and writing a book on nights and weekends, and sort of at the end stages of a relationship whose, lifetime had probably expired sometime earlier, and just like pushing all these things, taking a huge risk with my health. And I one day started crying. I'm not a crier. And I had no idea why I was crying.
Wow.
It's kind of obvious right now, right? The amount of stress. And so I found this really good cognitive behavioral therapist who helped me to rate the level of stress every day and what I was doing about it. And just that action of monitoring it started to help quite a bit. And, but I kind of, that kind of calmed things down for a little bit. And then the next year I actually got sick, physically very sick, was diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome. And, I think now it's probably undiagnosed celiac disease and other things, and probably just pure exhaustion, frankly. And my doctor told me you have to take a medical leave from work.
Wow.
Which I was not crazy about, but I did. I took 6 weeks off. I went to Austin, Texas, where I had a lot of friends, and hung out. And that's where I really committed to writing my first book, Why the Cops Fight. And I came back from that, and I was like, I could stay with this financial writing job, but you know what, if I do it, I'm going to get sick again. And, yeah, my student loans are going to be paid off, and yeah, I'm going to have a big 401k, but, I'm going to lose it all again if I'm not healthy. And for me to be healthy, I need to be doing what I'm supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
And that goes back to the purpose and the path that I was talking about before, that, that sometimes it becomes very clear that there is only one path, and the risk is not taking that path that might appear to other people to be hugely risky.
Yeah, I think that was one of the most powerful things I read in your book, because I have always thought I was irrational for being this entrepreneur, from walking away from a crazy good salary in finance. And yet for me, it didn't feel at all risky, because I knew this is what I was called to do. But I have struggled with that reconciliation of it looked irresponsible or it was crazy. But now when I read that in your book, I thought, oh, that's why to me it didn't feel like a risk. It felt like the only path there was that I could take. So that was very helpful. So thank you for that.
And it goes to a concept that my editor, Jessica Case, really asked me to expand a little bit, this idea of risk privilege, that, the risk is a choice, and having that choice, really is a privilege.
Yes.
And a lot of people don't necessarily have it. I mean, there's sometimes if you're a refugee, it's not really a choice, between certain death and poverty at home and getting on that rickety raft and braving the sharks. Right. And, I think with me, I had a supportive family. I had a certain amount of money stocked away. I had skills that are, worth quite a bit. And, so it was a privilege to be able to do what I wanted to do. And I recognize that. And, I just think about so much untapped human potential in the world. All of the people who don't have those kind of choices because they didn't have the sort of underlying support system. And I go back to that question, what's the risk of not creating this? You talk about economic growth, you talk about healthy societies, and there's got to be a better way to do it, to ensure that there's not so much human capital that we're just throwing away, because there are a lot of people who've got big dreams and may not have been born into the resources to be able to pursue them.
Never mind individual satisfaction. I mean, if we have a whole bunch of people walking around who are really deeply happy with what they do every day, it's going to be a different world. People are going to interact with each other very radically different than if they're doing what they think they're supposed to do, or is less risky, quote unquote.
Yeah.
So
you get much more productivity, you get lower health costs, you get higher tax revenues, you create a virtuous circle instead of what we got now.
That's right. Absolutely. God knows we need something better than what we got now. Michele, we could talk for another hour with you. So maybe you'll be willing to come back on at some point after you finish this book tour. There's so many questions more that I have on my list, but I think we'll close it there, because I'm sure you have lots of other podcasts to do today. Your book is extraordinary. It's changing my life. I know it's going to change the trader's life that I work with and that Lucas works with. So thank you for how long did it take you to write, by the way?
It's not, you get asked that all the time, and I never know how to answer. Like, I don't really know how to count, because it's kind of on and off. But I think I got the idea when I think in 2018, I think was when I decided, yes, this is the direction that I wanted to go.
Oh, damn, sister, that's quick.
That's a quick turnaround.
70 people being featured in it. It is such a breath, like wide, deep breath of experiences, people, and the way you put them into the perspective of risk. It's an astonishing work of art. So thank you for it.
Thank you. And thank you for loving it as much as I do.
Yeah, I really do. I love it very much. And I love you. I'm so happy to know you. And thank you for coming on our podcast. And please let us have you back on soon. Okay.
Would love that. I'm so happy to know you as well, and look forward to meeting you in person when that's a thing again.
Yes, absolutely. Come to Hawaii, and we'll show you how another version of risk unfolds here, which is very different than Northeast New York City and North Chicago.
I think I could manage that.
I think you could too. I think you do just great. All right. Well, we'll close it there. Everybody, please let us know what you think about this amazing book. It's going to change your life. It's going to change your trading. And we'll see you on the next episode of the Wall Street Coach Podcast. Thanks for tuning in.
This has been the Wall Street Coach Podcast with Ann Curtin. You can find out more about her and her team online at thewallstreetcoach.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please consider leaving a 5-star review on iTunes. Thank you for listening.